Hey folks, Zach Osterman here, Insider Indianapolis Star. This is an Insider video for February 19th. Apologies, been a little bit more radio silent than I intended to be this week. I've just had basically a sick kid at home, so been kind of splitting my time between uh, stuff that's professional and stuff that needed taken care of personally. Lots of Super Mario Brothers Wonder and Pokemon Brilliant Diamond at our house this week. Just a few kind of updates, I guess. Call this sort of like a checking in video. Nothing massive to talk about, but I know people want updates on the coaching search. They want updates on just kind of the direction of things for Indiana. The first thing I would do, and I will link this story in the video comments as well. Mike Nislek and I teamed up on a pretty sort of, at least as sweeping as we could, piece on sort of where things kind of started and the process as it unfolded behind the scenes with Mike Woodson's decision to step down at the end of this season, and then B, where basically where Indiana goes from here in the sort of short to medium term, because it's not easy. It's not it's not as clean cut as the average coaching search where you make the change at the end of the season and that kind of launches you immediately into the market. Again, I'll link that. I'm not just going to recap that entire article because it's pretty long, but I'll link it in the story comments, the video comments and description. But a few things I did want to pull out from that. Number one, I think it is fair to say Scott Dolson, based on people we've talked to, is going to work very, very hard to move discreetly on this, especially early on. There's no real desire to distract from the season that's still ongoing on Dolson's part. That's why I think he's probably going to be refraining from sort of discussing the future too much with current players. I think there will be a time and a place for that, because at the end of the day, if you're Indiana, you'd like to give your next coach every opportunity to kind of have a bit of a sort of an infrastructure or a foundation for their roster. But Dolson doesn't want the search to intrude upon the season very much. And I think the key there is it really doesn't need to, because again, if you're talking about kind of the process and the timeline, naturally, the vast majority of coaches Indiana is going to want to consider are working right now. There's been, obviously there was a fair bit of sort of Brad Stevens chatter. Stevens himself kind of made some comments to Jeff Goodman that dampened that down pretty substantially. But Stevens was, maybe the only candidate, that's been seriously linked to the job by anyone I've talked to at this point, who is, who could, in good faith, have conversations about the job right now, because you're not going to approach a sitting head coach who is coaching their season and you're not going to, put it this way, Indiana's not going to want to hire anybody who would want to have a conversation while the season was still going on, while they were still coaching their team, about potentially coming and coaching another team. That's probably a red flag. And so there is a lot of this that just kind of has to happen behind the scenes. What Mike and I gleaned was that Indiana is likely to follow a similar process to what Dolson, sort of the process Dolson used to come to Curt Cignetti, sort of asking his inner circle, for kind of a more forensic analysis, using football as the example of what had worked in the last, 30 odd years at Indiana, what had worked at peer programs to Indiana football, like Kansas, North Carolina, Kentucky, some others. And then sort of, essentially kind of chiseling out a list of either qualifications, bullet points, sort of key boxes to tick, however you want to phrase that from there. Then Indiana also engaged with Turnkey ZRG, which is maybe the preeminent search firm in the college sports space, to help with that process as well. I would be surprised if we don't see Turnkey involved again here. I would be pretty surprised if there's kind of no if there's no search firm involvement at some point. I don't know if that's necessarily right now, but at some point, again, the luxury, if you want to say, of having the certainty on the side of sort of the current coaching staff and knowing that this is all going to be coming to an end at the end of the season, is that Scott Dolson can kind of move deliberatively, through this process and doesn't have to rush anything. The big difference, I think, and ultimately, at least in terms of the structure of this search between Cignetti and Dolson, is Dolson fired Tom Allen on a Sunday morning, and he knew that basically by end of business Friday, he needed to have a head coach in place because you had to move so quickly with the portal window opening and just the timeline of kind of winter roster movement and roster construction in college football. He's going to have more time here. Now that does bring us to maybe if you want to talk about deadlines, because I think there are a couple of, Indiana's not going to be rushed into hiring the wrong coach. No program's going to do that. No department's going to do that. But there are some dates that I think are going to be instructive to, once Dolson feels like maybe he's found his candidate or his sort of narrow list of 2 or 3, and has a good feel for the idea that he can get at least one of them. The portal window this year opens a week later. Normally it opens the week that the NCAA tournament starts, or at least I don't say normally. It's not like it's been a regular thing, but in the last few years, normally the portal window opened the week after the second round of conference tournaments concluded. So players could start entering the portal during the first week of the NCAA tournament. This year, the portal will open March 24th, which is the Monday after the first weekend of the NCAA tournament. Now, crucially, the portal will only be open for 30 days rather than 45. It's important to note that window, that 30-day window, only applies to players entering the portal. It doesn't mean that you have to have everyone that you want out of the portal by the end of that 30-day window. It just means that any player who wants to enter the portal only has 30 days, whereas they had 45. So basically, we've bumped the opening of the window back a week, and then we've shortened the period in time that players can go into the portal. We have not shortened the period in time that players can come back out of the portal, that visits can be made, and all those sorts of things. But if Indiana's preferred candidate is out of the NCAA tournament after the first weekend, then Indiana is probably going to want to move quickly because they're going to want that coach in place as close to the opening of the portal window, both in terms of potentially having the opportunity to retain players on this roster that coach might want to keep, and also in terms of being able to move decisively in the portal as basically as soon as possible. That is relevant for kind of the other date that I think is important, and this is noted in the story. It's explained, pretty in depth, but it's a long story, and I wouldn't hold it against anybody who might have missed this. As things stand, the House settlement, which is the court case that's, if the settlement is approved, will bring about the revenue sharing model starting in the summer, starting with the next academic year, 25-26. The House settlement, as things stand, is scheduled to be approved on April 7th. Now, that can change. There have been objections, and there are different things that have to be worked through. I think it's probably fair to say that the feeling, the climate around it right now, as things stand, is everyone expects it to be approved. But again, that can always change. What's relevant to any basketball program in Indiana certainly will be in this, and would have been in this situation, whether there was a coaching change coming or not, because of how many players on Indiana's roster, just plain and simple, will run out of eligibility at the end of this season. Anybody who's trying to rebuild through the portal, and anybody who is going to want NIL to be a big piece of that, because NIL is not going anywhere. It's basically going to just sort of live alongside revenue sharing in the same way that, an NFL player, for example, is going to have their contract and their salary and their bonuses with their team, and then also any sort of endorsements or outside marketing deals that they and their representation put together. Part of the House settlement, a big part of the House settlement, is the establishment of the NCAA's NIL clearinghouse, which will require all NIL deals to essentially be submitted to the clearinghouse for what they're calling sort of a fair market value review. Deloitte is going to be handling that. And what it's essentially meant to do is make sure that is flagged down NIL deals that are being artificially inflated as a way of just sort of pumping money to athletes for for purposes of just sort of getting them to come play for whatever school, which I think everyone has recognized has been going on in the NAL space, pretty much since the beginning. There's a lot of skepticism about whether or not the clearinghouse stands up to legal scrutiny long term, but at least short term, it is going to be in place. And the current guidance says that the clearinghouse goes into effect for any NIL deal signed after the House settlement is approved. So as of right now, April 7 is the deadline. Any NIL deal entered into after April 7th has to go through the NIL clearinghouse. That means any NIL deal signed before April 7th does not. And that's obviously there's sort of the most basic reading of that, which is that means that teams can try and bypass the clearinghouse and kind of let the numbers be bigger and more inflated for at least one more year. I do think that it's relevant to point out it's also an opportunity to, for collectives and for people working in the NIL space to just sort of say, let's close the books on the coming academic year before we have to start submitting things to the clearinghouse. Then we can spend, 8-9 months evaluating how the clearinghouse works, what it looks like, what it's looking for. And that can give us a better idea of essentially how to operate within whatever boundaries or parameters the clearinghouse sets up going forward. So it's almost kind of a way of saying, if everybody can just kind of get their business done before the House settlement is approved in the NIL space, then that looks a little bit more like that gives everybody a little bit of time just to sort of bed into whatever needs to change in the NIL space relative to the clearinghouse, at least short term. So it's not a hard deadline for Indiana to have somebody in place by a certain date, but that April 7 date, the more time, the more working days Indiana can give its next head coach before that April 7 date, the better opportunity that coach is going to have to put together a really competitive roster. Not going to go too deep into names today. Again, I don't really think, there is a lot of noise around this. As things stand, this is going to be the biggest job open this year. I know there's been some questions about North Carolina, and we'll see where that goes. But as things stand, as currently projected, Indiana is going to be, by a significant margin, the most appealing job open in the Carousel this spring. So there's going to be a lot of talk about it. There's going to be a lot of noise. There's going to be a lot of interest. There's going to be a lot of speculation. And there's going to be an extent to which the Carousel is kind of, at the top end anyway, going to have to operate off of whatever Indiana does, because anyone who might want to be considered for high major jobs in other places, we know Virginia's going to come open. We know Florida State's going to come open. There are at least a few other jobs that I suspect in, let's say, the Power Four plus the Big East will come open, between now and maybe April 1. But a lot of those jobs are probably going to have to wait for Indiana to be resolved before they know exactly which candidates are available to them. Maybe not every one, but a decent amount of them. And so there's just going to be a lot of noise attached to the IU job. That noise does not always equate to truth or fact, and it doesn't even necessarily always equate to action. I think Scott Dolson is working right now on this, but he is working behind the scenes. Again, he is trying to be very discreet, and he's got the time to allow him to be very discreet. We saw Brad Stevens distance himself from the job. I don't think that was a surprise to anyone. I know there's been some talk about, a lot of speculation about Chris Beard. I guess the best thing I could say right now for someone like Chris Beard, maybe even someone like Will Wade, different sorts of situations, but I would turn down the temperature on something like that is probably the best way. Particularly Chris Beard, I would not go too far out over the cliff's edge on someone like Chris Beard at this point. But there is a lot. There's a lot, genuinely just like a lot to sort of to sort through, and a lot that I understand why there's interest in this. I understand why there's, why IU fans, maybe are even stressing about this or excited about the possibility of a new head coach and sort of a bit of a program restart. But there is, patience is going to have to be a virtue here for a while. unless Scott Dolson has a plan that involves someone who's not currently in a job, which would be someone like Tony Bennett, which would surprise me just given Bennett's sort of self-provided reasons for why he stepped away at Virginia back in the fall. Um, Beyond someone like that, I would be surprised if if there are hugely meaningful developments here in February. And again, even if that is Scott Dolson's intention, I think Dolson would still want to be as respectful to the ongoing season as possible and would not want to start sort of doing things that just sort of distract from that season. So I think we're still, and listen, this stuff is fluid and can change, and I recognize I'm being non-committal, forgive me, but my best read right now is you're still going to have to wait a couple, 3 weeks at least before the temperature really starts to turn up on the search in a more public way. We will still talk about it. Mike Neisel and I, forgive us, between sick kids and internet issues and whatever else, we've been meaning to podcast all week. We haven't yet. I think we're either aiming for a live Mind Your Banners on Wednesday afternoon or Thursday afternoon. Obviously, we'll tweet links, give you plenty of advance warning on that when we before we pull it all together. But we will have a podcast this week, both sort of looking at the bigger picture for Indiana and then also looking at what is, maybe the most important game of the season from the context of Indiana's NCAA tournament hopes as they stand Sunday at home against Purdue. So we'll leave it there for now, other than one last bit. IU Marquette got a date. It's Sunday, November 9th in Chicago. Tip-off time to be determined. That'll be part of a multi-team event. The other games in the MTE will just be guarantee games at home for both Marquette and Indiana. The MTE basically just being a mechanism for setting up the IU Marquette game at the United Center in Chicago. But that's got a date, and it's very early in the calendar. It's probably going to be one of the early sort of marquee matchups in next year's non-conference slate. So it'll be a fun one. But for now, until we talk again, I think a podcast either Wednesday or Thursday of this week with Mike Neisel. I'm Zach Osterman with the Indianapolis Star. Thank you so much for watching. We'll talk to you soon.